The late afternoon sun dipped low over the dusty lot of the Sheridan Livestock Auction. The crowd had thinned, leaving behind only the regulars, seasoned ranchers, weathered cowboys, and men who'd seen enough horses to know when one wasn't worth a dime. That's when they brought him out, a light chestnut Palomino, his thick blonde mane tangled and dull, ribs poking through his side like old fence posts. His legs shook with every step, and his eyes, large, soft, and distant, carried the kind of pain that made most men turn away. A few didn't. Thomas Rourke, standing near the rail in his worn boots and faded flannel, watched in silence. A Vietnam vet with a graying beard and eyes that had seen too much, Thomas didn't flinch when the first chuckles rose from the back. "Ain't even fit for glue," muttered Eldon Reese, chewing a toothpick. Bill McAllister laughed harder. "What's O.L. Rourke gonna do, give it a spa day?" Clay Hargrove, always tagging along, grinned. No one bothered to place a bid. That horse, with his sunken frame and overgrown hooves, wasn't going anywhere but down. $100, Thomas said, raising one hand calmly. Silence fell. A few heads turned. The auctioneer blinked in disbelief, then slammed the gavel. "Sold." Laughter exploded behind him. "You serious, Rourke?" Bill cackled. "You savon horses now?" Thomas said nothing. He just stepped forward, slowly and deliberately, and placed his hand on the Palomino's warm, trembling neck. There was a flicker in the animal's eye. Not strength, not yet, but something alive. Thomas whispered to him as he gently coaxed the horse toward his old trailer, taking his time, like every step mattered. Back at his ranch, Thomas cleared out a quiet corner of the barn and laid down fresh straw. He spread an old quilt across it, the same one his late wife had made decades ago. The Palomino collapsed the moment he was inside, sides heaving with effort. Thomas sat beside him, just watching. He didn't sleep. He only wrote in his notebook, "If he gives up, I give up." The next morning, he took the horse, now named Elijah, to Dr. Amos Vickery, the town vet. "Too far gone," the man said. "Best thing would be to let him go." But Thomas shook his head. "He's still got something in him." Vickery just sighed. The town laughed for days. Said Thomas had finally snapped. But a week later, on a quiet gray morning, Elijah did something none of them expected. He stood up. And that changed everything. The morning Elijah stood on his own, the barn filled with a kind of silence Thomas hadn't felt in years. No wind. No birds. Just the soft sound of hooves shifting in straw. Thomas stood still, barely breathing, watching the Palomino sway on unsteady legs. The horse was thinner than ever, still clearly weak, but his posture had changed. His head lifted just enough, his ears twitching toward the sound of Thomas's voice. It was subtle, but it was something. And after weeks of doubt, that something felt like a miracle. Thomas began to speak to Elijah each morning as if he were an old friend. His tone was calm and gravelly, worn down from years of silence. He spoke about the war, about the long nights after his wife, June, passed. He confessed things he'd never told another soul, not even his therapist at the VA hospital. Elijah never responded, of course. But the horse listened, eyes blinking slowly, tail flicking at the dust. And in that space, between breath and silence, Thomas began to heal too. Word about the horse started to spread around Sheridan. The same men who had mocked Thomas at the auction were now stopping by his fence line, just to catch a glimpse. Clay Hargrove came by first, pretending to check the water pump near the property line. He squinted toward the barn and muttered, "Well, I'll be damned. That thing's still alive." Bill McAllister, never far behind, snorted. "Don't mean he's useful. Just means he's slow to die." But Thomas didn't rise to it. He just kept walking. One afternoon, Thomas heard footsteps outside the barn and turned to find a boy standing quietly by the door. Nathan Bellamy, barely 12, with freckles across his nose and a shy look in his eyes. He was Harlan Bellamy's grandson, Thomas's neighbor from way back. "Can I see him?" the boy asked. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Nathan stepped inside slowly, his eyes wide when they landed on Elijah. "He's beautiful," the boy whispered. And for the first time in years, Thomas smiled. Nathan began visiting almost every day after school. He'd sit in the straw beside Elijah, sometimes sketching the horse in a spiral notebook, sometimes just talking about his day. Thomas didn't mind. In fact, he looked forward to it. There was something grounding about the boy's presence, something that filled in the quiet spaces that grief had hollowed out long ago. But not everyone was pleased. Word reached the local diner where Eldon Reese liked to stir up opinions over black coffee. "Rourke's settin' a dangerous example," he grumbled. "Bringin' a boy into a place full of false hope and a dyin' animal? Ain't right." No one dared argue, not yet. But the whispers had started, and they were getting louder. Elijah was still frail, but each day he held himself taller, stood a little longer, ate a little more. The change was slow, almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't spend hours beside him, but Thomas saw it. He saw it in the brightness returning to Elijah's eyes, in the way he greeted Thomas each morning with a low, rumbling breath through his nostrils. There was intelligence in that gaze. Not just survival, purpose. It was as if Elijah remembered something the rest of the world had forgotten. One rainy afternoon, Nathan asked a question that Thomas hadn't prepared for. "Why him?" the boy said softly, sitting cross-legged near Elijah's front hoof. "Why'd you pick the one nobody wanted?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched the rain slide down the barn's wooden beams, the soft tapping of water mixing with the horses' steady breaths. "Because I know what it's like," Thomas finally said. "To be looked at like you've got nothing left. To be broken, and still breathing." Nathan didn't speak. He just nodded, a quiet understanding that said more than words. Clay wasn't sure what to think anymore. He'd seen the horse himself. It didn't look dangerous, just different. But when Bill muttered something about Thomas being off in the head, Clay nodded, like he always did. No one wanted to be the first to defend the man who'd become the town's quiet question mark. One morning, while brushing Elijah's thick blonde mane, Nathan noticed a deep scar near the base of the horse's neck, almost hidden beneath his coat. "What happened here?" he asked. Thomas hesitated. He hadn't seen it before, not clearly. Gently, he ran his fingers over the old wound. "Could be from a whip or barbed wire," he said softly. "He's been hurt before." The way he said it made Nathan shiver. Not just because of the scar, but because Thomas looked like he was remembering a wound of his own. The bond between the three, man, boy, and horse, was growing stronger. But it wasn't just about healing anymore. Thomas had begun to suspect that Elijah had been through more than simple neglect. There was something buried deeper, behind those eyes. A story no one had told yet. And the more Thomas looked into them, the more he felt it. Elijah remembered. And what he remembered might change everything. The scar near Elijah's neck haunted Thomas more than he wanted to admit. It wasn't just the location. It was the way the skin had healed, uneven and harsh, like the wound had been left untreated for far too long. Over the next few days, Thomas kept running his fingers over it gently, as if the skin might whisper a story back to him. He had seen scars like that before, not on horses, but on men. And each time he touched it, memories of war flashed in his mind. Prisoners, strays, lost souls. The way pain leaves a mark that outlives the injury. Nathan had started asking questions. Real ones. Where did Elijah come from before the auction? He asked one evening while feeding the horse apple slices. Thomas paused, his brow furrowed. "He wasn't tagged," he muttered. "No brand, no papers. That's not normal for a horse that size and breed. Someone didn't want him traced. Nathan blinked, taking that in. You think he was abused? Thomas didn't answer, but the way his jaw tightened was all the confirmation the boy needed. Meanwhile, the whispers in town had turned into real concern. Harlan Bellamy, Nathan's grandfather, showed up at Thomas's barn one Sunday afternoon. He stood just outside the door, arms folded, boots wet with creek mud. He's a boy, Thomas. And that animal's not right, he said plainly. You've been through hell, and I know you mean well, but people are worried. Thomas didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just nodded, wiped his hands on a rag and said, I'm not forcing Nathan to come here. He chooses to. Harlan stared at him for a long time. That's the problem, he finally muttered, before turning and walking back to his truck. Thomas watched him go, feeling that old weight in his chest again, the one that always came when people looked at him like he was dangerous or broken. But this wasn't about him anymore. It was about Elijah, and maybe about Nathan too. 3 lives drawn together by silence and wounds no one else could see. That night, Thomas pulled out the leather-bound notebook and flipped through its pages. In between entries about Elijah's appetite, weight, and grooming schedule, he began jotting down notes about the scar. No registration tag, possibly from illegal training or transport. Signs of intentional injury. It felt strange, writing like that, like a man building a case. But deep down, he knew, something about Elijah's past didn't add up. And if someone had tried to bury that past, Thomas was ready to dig it up. It was a cold morning when Thomas decided he couldn't sit on his suspicions any longer. Elijah was growing stronger each day, his coat regaining its sheen, his weight slowly returning, but the questions surrounding his past refused to fade. That scar. The missing tag. The way Elijah still flinched at sudden noises. Thomas had seen enough trauma in men to recognize it in an animal. And something inside him whispered, this horse didn't just come from neglect, he came from something darker. After a long call with an old friend who once worked with the Bureau of Land Management, Thomas packed up a photo of Elijah and a few notes he'd scribbled into his notebook. He drove 3 hours to a small outpost where livestock records were kept. The clerk, a tired man named Dale Kessler, squinted at the picture and raised an eyebrow. You're saying this one didn't have a brand or tag at auction? Thomas nodded. Dale scratched his head. That's not common. A horse like this. Palomino build, heavy structure, blonde mane, that's Haflinger blood. Usually bred for specialized work. Or therapy. Therapy. That word hit Thomas in the chest like a hammer. Elijah, as a therapy horse? The idea didn't make sense, not at first. But Dale kept talking. There was a ranch down near Rock Springs. Private facility. Shut down a couple years ago. All kinds of licensing issues. Some of their animals got seized. Others, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Thomas's throat tightened. A ranch for therapy animals, shut down under suspicion. It was a lead. And maybe, just maybe, it explained the pain in Elijah's eyes. Back home, Thomas told Nathan bits and pieces. Not all of it, not yet. He may have helped people once, Thomas said quietly, brushing Elijah's mane. And something happened. Something wrong. Nathan, sitting cross-legged beside the stall, stared at the horse with new reverence. Maybe that's why he's helping us now, the boy said. His voice was soft but sure. Like, he remembers how. Meanwhile, the tension in town was nearing its breaking point. At the diner, Eldon loudly declared that Elijah should be put down before someone gets hurt. Bill McAllister nodded along, warning that if something wasn't done soon, they'd call the sheriff themselves. People were no longer whispering. They were planning. But inside the barn, surrounded by hay and healing, Thomas looked into Elijah's eyes and saw something terrifying and beautiful all at once. He wasn't just saving the horse was saving him too. The next morning, Thomas woke before dawn, coffee in hand, staring out at the frost-covered fields beyond the barn. Elijah was up early too, pacing gently inside his stall, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. There was strength in the way he moved now, not just physical, but emotional. The fear in his eyes had softened. And Thomas, more than anyone, knew how long it took for fear to loosen its grip. That kind of change didn't come from food or medicine. It came from safety, from trust, from being seen. By noon, the call came in. Dale Kessler had pulled some records from a closed federal archive. One horse on the report, a halflinger named Chance, matched Elijah's description almost perfectly. Same age, same markings. The notes were brief but chilling. Involved in behavioral therapy program. Facility closed due to reports of neglect and unauthorized medical procedures. Several animals unaccounted for. Thomas stared at the screen, heart pounding. Elijah hadn't just been forgotten. He had been erased. Thomas printed everything and placed it in a folder. It felt heavy in his hands, like holding the missing pieces of a broken story. That evening, he invited Harlan Bellamy to the barn. Harlan came reluctantly, clearly prepared for a confrontation. Instead, Thomas handed him the report. Harlan read in silence, his weathered face slowly shifting from skepticism to concern. "They did this to him?" he asked quietly. Thomas nodded. "And now people want him put down, because they don't know the truth." Harlan stayed longer than expected, kneeling beside Elijah, running a hand down his back. "He's not what they think he is," he said. Thomas only nodded. The next day, Harlan brought Nathan's drawings, detailed, careful sketches of Elijah's healing, and helped Thomas organize everything into a single binder. It wasn't just documentation now. It was evidence. Proof that Elijah's life mattered, that he wasn't some broken animal, but a survivor. The two men drove into town that week to meet with the sheriff and the local vet board. They laid out the reports, the photos, and the registration match. It was quiet in the room for a long time. Then the sheriff leaned back and said, "Well, this changes a few things." Back in Sheridan, word spread fast, but this time it wasn't whispers. It was something else. It was respect. For the first time in months, Thomas walked into the diner and didn't feel the weight of every eye in the room. A few heads still turned, but not with scorn, with curiosity, even a flicker of something softer. Harlan Bellamy had spoken up at the feed store that morning, showing the binder to a few of the regulars. He wasn't dramatic, just direct. That horse didn't come from nowhere. He was thrown away. And Rourke, he picked him back up. In a town where reputation traveled faster than fact, those words carried more weight than Thomas could have imagined. Back at the ranch, Elijah continued to thrive. His coat had grown thick and golden, glowing when the sunlight poured through the cracks in the barn walls. Nathan had started teaching him simple commands again, gentle ones, spoken softly. Walk, stop, head down. Elijah responded slowly, but consistently. It was almost as if the horse remembered the structure, like his old training wasn't entirely gone, just buried beneath layers of pain. Watching the boy and the horse work together made something stir in Thomas. Not just pride. Something deeper. Like hope was starting to feel real. But not everyone was ready to let go of old judgments. At the next town meeting, Bill McAllister stood up and questioned whether a horse with a history like that should even be kept on private property. "Therapy horse or not," he said, "you don't know what trauma does to an animal long-term." Thomas stood too. "And you don't know what healing looks like when you're not the one doing the work," he said. The room went silent. Then Harlan added, "He's doing more good in that barn than most folks do in a lifetime." The silence held longer this time, but no one challenged it. That week, something unexpected happened. A woman from Casper, nearly 2 hours away, called Thomas after hearing about Elijah through a friend. She worked with veterans and trauma survivors and asked, cautiously, if there was any chance Elijah could be seen, just once, by a group of retired soldiers. Some of them haven't spoken in weeks, she said. Horses like him, they can get through in ways we can't. Thomas didn't hesitate. He's not ready for crowds, he replied. But he's ready for connection. When the van of veterans arrived the following weekend, something changed in the air. The moment Elijah stepped out into the open paddock and looked at those men, quiet and scarred like Thomas, no one had to explain anything. The horse already knew. The veterans stepped out of the van slowly, some with canes, others leaning on the shoulders of men who had once worn the same uniform. Their eyes scanned the quiet pasture where Elijah waited, his head lifted, mane catching the wind like a flag. Thomas stood beside him, one hand resting gently on the horse's side. The air was still. No small talk. No introductions. Just a group of men and one animal, all carrying more than they'd ever said out loud. One of the younger vets, a man in his 50s with a missing ring finger and distant eyes, stepped forward first. He didn't speak. He just looked at Elijah, then reached out a hand. The Palomino didn't flinch. He moved toward him, slow and steady, and placed his nose against the man's palm. That was it. No trick. No therapy session. Just touch. But the man's shoulders started to shake. Not from fear, but from something finally letting go. Thomas had seen a lot of pain in his life, in jungles overseas, in hospital waiting rooms, in the mirror, but nothing quite like this. One by one, the veterans approached Elijah. Some cried. Some didn't. One man simply sat on the ground and stared for 20 minutes without saying a word. And Elijah, patient as ever, stayed with each of them. He didn't do anything grand. But he was something grand, a quiet presence in a world full of noise. Afterward, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, the woman from Casper approached Thomas. Her name was Lena Wells, and she wiped her eyes as she spoke. "I've worked with animals a long time," she said. "But that horse, there's something in him that pulls the pain out of people. Like he doesn't just carry his own, he carries ours too." Thomas looked at Elijah, who now stood with Nathan brushing his mane, and nodded. "I used to think I rescued him," he said. "But now I'm not so sure." That night, Thomas sat alone on the porch with his notebook open in his lap. For weeks, it had been filled with reports, medical notes, old memories. But now, he just wrote one thing. He was never broken. He was just waiting to be seen. As he closed the notebook, a soft nudge came at his side. Elijah, standing beside him, eyes calm. Thomas placed his hand on the horse's neck. And in that moment, the silence inside him finally broke. The days that followed the veteran's visit felt different. Not just on the ranch, but in the whole town. Word had spread, not through gossip this time, but through quiet respect. People started stopping by the fence not to mock, but to admire. A few even left apples or notes on the gate. Thomas kept his distance, still wary of too much attention, but he felt it. The shift. What had started as ridicule had turned into recognition. Elijah was no longer just that sick horse from the auction. He was something else now. A symbol of survival. Nathan walked taller too. At school, kids asked him about Elijah. Teachers mentioned his drawings. Even Harlan, once hesitant, had begun helping with repairs around the barn. Patching the old roof, replacing broken hinges, quietly contributing like it had been his idea all along. There was peace settling over the ranch. A strange, beautiful calm that Thomas hadn't felt in decades. But in the back of his mind, he knew peace never stayed long. Especially in places where healing had just begun. One evening, dark clouds rolled in fast, thick and angry over the mountains. By nightfall, the wind howled through the fields and rain beat down in heavy sheets. Thomas rushed to the barn, lantern in hand, water dripping from his coat. Elijah was uneasy, pacing, ears flicking with every rumble of thunder. "Easy, boy," Thomas whispered, placing a hand on his side. But the storm was different this time. Louder, wilder, and it stirred something old in Elijah's memory. A loud crack of lightning hit nearby, followed by the explosive crash of a tree falling at the edge of the property. Elijah reared back in panic, slamming against the stall door. It burst open, the latch snapping under pressure. Thomas lunged, trying to calm him, but the Palomino bolted into the rain, hooves slipping on the muddy ground. "Elijah!" Thomas shouted into the storm, but the horse was already a shadow in the night. Nathan arrived minutes later, soaked and breathless. "I saw him run," he cried. "Where'd he go?" Thomas grabbed a flashlight and his coat. "I don't know, but we're gonna find him." For a moment, they looked at each other, fear and determination in both their eyes. The storm outside raged harder, but the storm inside Thomas was so much worse. The rain hadn't stopped. Hours had passed since Elijah disappeared into the darkness, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Mud clung to Thomas's boots as he and Nathan moved through the fields with flashlights, calling out the horse's name. "Elijah! Boy, where are you?" The wind whipped their voices away. Trees swayed violently, creaking under pressure. Each minute that passed felt heavier than the last, not just with fear, but with the weight of everything they stood to lose. Thomas stopped near the old creek bed, panting, soaked to the bone. He turned off his flashlight for a moment, closed his eyes, and listened. Not to the storm, but to the silence underneath it. That same stillness he had once felt in the barn, the place where Elijah had first stood on his own. He breathed in, let go of the panic, and then, far off, heard it, the soft clinking of hooves on stone. They found him near the ridge, standing still in the rain, facing the valley below. Elijah wasn't panicked anymore. He was calm. Soaked, trembling slightly, but calm. Thomas approached slowly, arms out. "Easy, boy, we're here." Elijah turned his head toward him, eyes soft. Nathan reached out, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "He came up here on purpose," the boy said. "Like he was waiting for us." Thomas nodded, wrapping the lead rope around Elijah's halter. "He always was leading us somewhere." Back at the ranch, the storm finally broke. The clouds parted just enough to let morning light slip through. Harlan was waiting at the gate with towels and a thermos of coffee. "I heard the shouting," he said. "Figured you'd need help." No one spoke much. They just led Elijah into the barn, dried him off, and made sure he was safe. There were no big speeches, no applause, just quiet gratitude, and the sense that something had been restored. In the weeks that followed, things settled into something new. Not the old routine, but something better. Elijah became a local legend, but more than that, a presence. Veterans continued to visit. Nathan's drawings were displayed at the town library. And Thomas, he changed too. He spoke more. He smiled more. He even started volunteering at the community center on Sundays, something he never imagined himself doing. One afternoon, as he brushed Elijah under a warm spring sun, Thomas whispered, "You were never just a broken horse." He paused, then added, "You were the reason I remembered how to live." And in Elijah's eyes was the answer he'd been searching for all along.